Anti-deportation protests continued last night on the streets of downtown Los Angeles. You can see police there moving in to enforce a curfew put in place in part of downtown LA. Last night, police arrested more than 200 people in the curfew zone. These protests erupted in LA several days ago after U.S. agents carried out raids against undocumented migrants. And in response, U.S. President Donald Trump sent in the National Guard and activated hundreds of Marines, all of it against the wishes of the state government. Joining me now from Los Angeles yet again is NBC senior correspondent Jay Gray. Jay, what's the latest on the ground where you are right now?
Yeah, well, David, let's give you a first-hand look. And what I can show you right now is we're just outside the federal complex where you've got not only the National Guard, which has been here for 6 days now, but you've also got ACE agents that are stationed here. And this has been a real flashpoint for a lot of the protests that we have seen build and then move throughout the downtown area here. You talked about that curfew overnight. It was really just a triangle section that's a little over a mile wide. They shut things down around 8 o'clock, but there were a lot of people who decided they weren't going to leave, that they wanted these protests to continue. They gave them a bit of leeway, but then ultimately what they did was round a bunch of those who refused to leave up and take them to jail. Now, I have to tell you, that was the first night in several where we haven't seen any fires, we haven't seen any damage or looting. There were significant arrests. More than 100 people were arrested. But again, it was the first night in at least 3 or 4 where we haven't seen violence in the streets of Los Angeles once the sun went down. So it did work, and it worked so well. In fact, the mayor here has said she's going to do it again. She's going to enforce the curfew again this evening and for as long as necessary, she says, to keep things safe.
Okay, but so Jay, it seems to have gotten to a level of control, but the Trump administration is digging in on the deployment of the National Guard, saying it's not afraid to go further, but the city seems to be handling these things, right? So how is this playing out in the city right now?
Well, there's a lot of frustration and that political tug of war, if you will, between the mayor here, the governor, Gavin Newsom, saying that we've got this handled and did before the White House decided to initially send in the National Guard and now sending in 700 Marines. They say that that's really escalated things in this area. And in fact, you see a real definitive line between what they're trying to do here in California and what the White House believes is the right thing to do. Because during the day, during the morning hours, and until there's something that's serious, you don't see any police officers, certainly not in riot gear. Now, there's officers posted in certain areas, but not in riot gear, opposed to what you see here from the federal effort here. They've federalized these National Guard members. They've got members of the ICE patrol out here as well. And so it's a real difference in philosophies, and you see it. It's very abrupt when you're here on the ground with it.
All right, Jay, thank you for joining us 2 days in a row, man. That's NBC senior correspondent Jay Gray in Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, that's the latest from LA, but protests against President Trump's deportation raids are spreading to cities across the United States. Okay, that's Baltimore, just one of several major cities where rallies are being held in solidarity with Los Angeles. The Trump administration says it's watching and it's ready to respond if necessary.
We're not scared to go further. We're not frightened to do something else if we need to.
If in other places, if there are other riots in places where law enforcement officers are threatened, we would have the capability to surge National Guard there if necessary.
Rachel E. VanLandingham is a professor of law at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles, also a retired lieutenant colonel, that's the way they say it in the United States, in the U.S. Air Force. Rachel VanLandingham, it's good to meet you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We have seen the military deployed in U.S. cities in the past. Los Angeles in 1992 after the riots. This is not the 1992 riots, though. I mean, how does this deployment differ from those in the past?
It differs tremendously. The last time the Insurrection Act was invoked and we had National Guard members federalized, put under the president's command and control, was in 1992 when our governor requested help from the president, because at that point, when it was requested, there were over 60 individuals were killed in riots, and hundreds of businesses were on fire. I live in Los Angeles. I was downtown yesterday, where the peaceful protests were occurring. Facts on the ground, this is nothing like it. There has been sporadic violence at night. The LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, for the last few days has been more aggressive in their responses, and the mayor enacted a curfew last night, which really helped things, as well as engaged in arrests over the course of a few days, with the LAPD engaging in those arrests. So the fact that we have National Guard members that are federalized, that are deployed here and just kind of standing around at this point, it really seemed like this federalization of the troops and sending them in was unnecessary, and in fact inflamed tensions more.
If you listen to the language, though, coming from the White House, from the president, from his spokespeople, from his cabinet officials, they are describing this moment in L.A. like it is the 1992 L.A. riots, right? Comparing it to an insurrection and sort of using that as a justification for this action. I mean, how is he legally justifying this deployment, despite the state objecting to it and it not being at the scale of the really awful riots we've seen in the past?
Well, they have a narrative and they're pushing it, and they're pushing false information and false facts. I mean, there has been some violence associated with the protests, but in our way of government with federalism, states have the primary responsibility and authority to keep our city streets safe. And in fact, when the National Guard worked for Governor Gavin Newsom, one of their jobs is to engage in law enforcement, to help local law enforcement. They have that authority. He decided it was not yet necessary. However, that authority was then taken from him and yanked from him when the president preemptively, in a very performative manner, federalized these troops. But on a technical legal basis, the president, in my professional opinion, is on firm legal ground in that federalization. And why? It's because we have broadly written federal statutes that allow him to do this. And the statute that was used, the categories, the basis, provides 3 categories, and one of the bases for federalizing the National Guard troops, and you don't have to get the state governor to request it. The basis is when there's rebellion or danger of rebellion against federal authority. And because you had protesters surrounding a federal detention center, protesters at some point that seemed to be trying to impede ICE agents and chanting and demanding that detainees be released. Therefore, you have some facts that a reasonable person could point to and say, there's a danger of a rebellion against federal authority. Is it like any danger of rebellion that we've ever seen in which the troops were federalized and deployed to our city streets? Absolutely not. It's light years away from any of that, but you have a technical legal ground because you have 2 broadly written statutes which give quite a bit of discretion to the president.
Okay, that is interesting, because a protest outside of a federal building does not scream rebellion to me, but I guess if you extend the definition. But, you know, the president has used the word insurrection, which is an interesting phrase to hear him speaking about in this context, and suggested that the Insurrection Act could be used. Would that be legal, and what would that change?
Well, this president's been jonesing to use the Insurrection Act and become a authoritarian tyrant that uses military force on our city streets to suppress civil liberties, and to go after his political opponents since he was first president. So I'm not surprised he used the term this week of violent insurrectionist mobs on the streets of LA. And again, I'm in LA and there are no violent insurrectionist mobs. There have been instigators and agitators who are now being arrested by our Los Angeles Police Department, who are valiantly and honorably providing law enforcement here. So when the president uses violent insurrectionist mob, he's laying the groundwork to trigger the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act provides for the primary exception to other federal law, the Posse Comitatus Act, that prohibits the use of federal troops in law enforcement to execute and enforce U.S. domestic law. Our founding fathers never wanted federal troops on the city streets to enforce federal law, because that's one of the reasons we fought the British,
Right.
because the redcoats were being used against the American colonists and searching their homes without basis and arresting people, etc. So there's a long-standing both statutory, legal, and historical tradition against using federal troops on the streets in law enforcement capacity. President Trump's trying to thread the needle right now and say, oh, they're just protecting federal assets, protecting federal buildings. But today in Los Angeles, we had a general who's in charge of some of these federalized National Guard troops just tell the press he's been told to go ahead and escort, protect federal law enforcement, ICE agents, as they conduct raids. Protecting individual ICE agents as they enforce federal law is law enforcement, and therefore it's unlawful, and our commanders here should be disobeying that unlawful order until and unless the president invokes the Insurrection Act. But there's a problem with the Insurrection Act that's been pointed out by experts for years, and that is it's really broadly written too. It's actually an assembly of 5 different federal statutes. And it, again, is very broadly written regarding unlawful conspiracies and unlawful combinations and assemblages that help prevent federal law from being executed. I mean, that's just one of the bases outside of rebellion, et cetera. So it does provide some really big wiggle room for the president to shoehorn this into. However, factually, this differs drastically from the last time it was used in 1992. Plus, it differs drastically from the last time it was used against a governor's wishes. And that was in 1965 when President Lyndon Baines Johnson sent and federalized the National Guard in order to protect civil rights protesters, ironically enough.
Yeah, the march from Selma to Montgomery, and I think before that might have been in Arkansas with the integration of the school system. So it is these extreme flashpoints. So while he may be on legal ground with the nationalization, federalization of the National Guard.
Because it's so broadly written. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. But like the Marines have been mobilized, but for them to be operationalized, you would probably need the Insurrection Act. And whether it's, and that's a whole other question, but whether it's legal or not.
If it's in a purely protective protective function, right? And that's where they're trying to thread the needle, say they're just protecting federal assets. But at some point, protection of federal assets becomes executing federal law if you're protecting federal law enforcement personnel while they're enforcing the law. So we're getting really dangerously close to law enforcement anyway.
But just as a final point, it's the legality of it is one thing. The norms, the disruption of the norms are another thing, right? In that this is just not how it is done in the United States. And this seems to be a confrontation and a test Donald Trump welcomed because of his disdain for Governor Newsom, the political makeup of California and Los Angeles maybe in particular. The precedent all of this could set for New York, for Pennsylvania, for any of the Illinois, because he's got this focus on Chicago and what happens in Chicago. There is a real slippery slope potential here, is there not, just 5 months into this presidency?
100%. Something can be lawful, but it can be awful. Nazi Germany had a lot of laws, and what they were doing was ostensibly lawful under German law, but it was atrocious and awful. So what President Trump is doing is upending all the norms, ignoring the safeguards, the normative safeguards that are built into when do we use these powers and when and why do we wait to use them very sparingly?
Right.
Because we have had college kids killed by National Guard members in the 1970s at the Kent State, what was called the Kent State Massacre. And look at those military members. Has now called up 4,000 National Guard men and women, wrested them away from their families. They're not just sitting around. They're not active duty, already in uniform. They're citizen soldiers. They're at work. They've taken them out of their workplace, away from their families. They're sleeping in buildings downtown Los Angeles. Now they're putting them in some tents at a local reserve base. That's how they're being treated. It's incredibly disrespectful. They are not needed. This is provocative. He's trying to set that precedent that you said, and I'm afraid it's going to be replicated across the country.
Okay, it was really, we really appreciate your time. That's retired Lieutenant Colonel Rachel E. VanLandingham, who's also a professor of law at Southwestern Law School in LA. Thank you. It's good to meet you.
Thanks. Thank you.